Okay, and we're back to Collateral Banter episode 45. That's right, 45. I'm excited on this episode to be talking about a theme that I have been saying I'm going to talk about, but have sometimes neglected, which is democracy. That's the whole point of this podcast, isn't it? So, yeah, I want to talk about democracy, and I want to discuss what is happening around the world on October 30th, 2019. There are some protests going on all around the world, different continents, different countries that I think are really exciting, really interesting to see the commonalities across the protests, common themes that I see in each of these different protest movements. So the ones that I'll focus on, and this isn't to say that there aren't other protests, but I want to talk about Chile, Lebanon, Haiti, Iraq, and of course, can't forget Hong Kong and what's going on over there. So protest movements is that a lot of them are led by young people. They are led by young people who are at the university level or recent graduates. So it's the youth movement in a lot of countries. Young adults who are protesting and organizing a lot of these movements, right? And they come from different social society sectors. Some are protesting student fees. Other ones are protesting environmental degradation. And you have other protest movements joining this youth movement. And you don't see in this youth organizing that there's necessarily one spokesman and one leader leading the movement, right? There's a sort of modern design of a protest movement, which is this sort of horizontal organization that allows a lot of different movements and protests to come in. So the protest in Lebanon was over attacks on WhatsApp, which, by the way, I have. And then there is, in Chile, there was a complaint about increase in the fares for subways. So that affected students directly. They organized online a day for everybody to evade the increase in fares. And now the protests have been able to be sustained because things haven't been addressed for a long time. Protests in Chile is nothing new. It's been happening on for a while, but the elites have failed to meet the demands oftentimes of these movements. And so they're trying to shift the costs and higher taxes and higher fees onto people. And as they're cutting other programs and other social services, trying to privatize that, shift all the cost onto people, and people are now using this as a movement to fight back. So yes, it's led by young people organizing online, but they're taking to the streets and in large numbers. I mean, we're talking about millions of people. So that's what I would say is sort of the profile and demographic that I've seen that is really exciting. It is feminist leaders, environmental activists, young people, college students all coming together and forming sort of a coalition protest of civil society across all these different countries that you see, each one having their own sort of characteristics depending on the region they're from, but it is often led by these sort of young people and protesters, and not necessarily led by one political party that is able to galvanize. So today's protest is this horizontal movement. So getting into the protests, it's interesting to see that across many of these protest movements, Haiti, for example, protesting government corruption, where the president there is taking money away, donations that are given to rebuild Haiti. You've seen in Lebanon people protesting government graft, corruption, which is so systemic in Lebanon. In Chile as well, right? Social services, corruption, police brutality, and things like that. That has been one of the sort of common themes, is that governments that are so corrupt that people now are, seeing people take away money from them and then shift the cost by privatizing and forcing people to pay higher taxes for government services that aren't even there. You can see how protest movements are now organizing in such a way where people are fighting back the only way they know how, which is to take over the streets. So corruption has been such, I heard a story, I was reading Lebanon, that the prime minister had paid off a model South African model, $16.4 million. I mean, can you imagine that for a country, large amount of poverty, large amount of inequality, that you have the person leading the country paying off some South African model? I mean, how long do people think that sort of environment's going to last, right? In this sort of horizontal, sort of networked world, a lot of this information and data about corruption, lack of transparency is easy to be disseminated and spread to people at almost no cost. So people are able to share a lot of information about people and to get people to go out there and start protesting. So I think corruption is one of those themes. So it's young people protesting corruption, right? And another thing that I found very interesting in these sort of 4 or 5 countries that I'm looking at is in Chile and Lebanon specifically, the people leading the country are the richest people in that country, right? They're the richest people in that country. And I think that's really fascinating. They're both billionaires. Hariri in Lebanon, and then president of Chile, Piñera, is another billionaire. And I know Piñera is the richest Chilean in the world. And I don't know about Hariri, but I think is as well. And it's so fascinating to see that the people in power today are billionaires governing their country and still involved in corruption. I mean, how do you think they became billionaires, right? And so it's this sort of movement, or not just it's not young people just protesting corruption, but you see who is the one that's stealing and taking money away and then privatizing and shifting the cost, making the burden on the average people's lives so much harder. I wouldn't be surprised if the Iraqi prime minister is, multi-millionaire, and the Haitian president as well doesn't have millions of dollars, maybe billions, I don't know, stashed away somewhere. So it's either the millionaires and the billionaire class of people implementing these policies but not really servicing the people, which, they win elections and they get elected. But now the social issues that haven't been addressed, haven't even been tried to be addressed, are now at a critical juncture point. So these sort of things like a WhatsApp tax and a fare hike on the transportation system in Chile, the WhatsApp tax in Lebanon, those are sort of minor issues. Hong Kong, it was about pulling the extradition treaty, but that's not even the protest movement anymore. In Hong Kong, from what I'm reading, it is now about the relationship between Hong Kong and China. It is about fighting for democracy. So the issues, yes, it's this one issue that ignites the movement, but then it actually is about a much larger issue. And you also see that in all those countries, that it is significantly more than what it is, that initial spark. That initial spark comes sort of a secondary issue, but of course governments want to address those issues, but they don't really know who to organize or negotiate with, given that it's sort of a horizontal movement. There are leaders, but there isn't one leader that is leading this movement and is the spokesperson for the movement, right? You're seeing this sort of horizontal fight across the country. That is, an exciting part about these movements, that the protest movements are able to include so many different people with so many different demands and problems they've been suffering in society that are systemic, long-term, and dealing them for decades, but now pressuring people to protest. So it's young people protesting corruptions by billionaires in power. But then there is another issue. I think what's been also so amazing, as I was saying, about getting so many different people together protesting and taking to the streets, is the large percentage of people protesting. So I just want to give you 2 examples that I think are most blatant here. I got to say that in Chile, a country of about 18 million people, 5% of the population, about 1 million people, were out in the streets protesting. And that's pretty amazing. 5% would be about 15, 16 million people in the United States protesting. 16 million people, that would be incredible. That would be in every newspaper and every channel, to see 16 million Americans protesting, I guess in one location, right? Would be really powerful event to see in one area. But that, I think, is so powerful that these movements, now organized online, given the worsening conditions for so many people by corrupt billionaires, has now sort of sparked this movement that has gathering social movements and civil society together to start protesting governments. So yes, 5% in Chile. Seems a lot. what's probably the most exciting is the fact that in Lebanon, you've gotten 25% of the population, 1 million people, out of 6.8 million people in Lebanon today. You got 25% of the population protesting the government. And I think that that's so amazing that 25% would be 75 million Americans, something like that, out there in the streets. Can you imagine 75 million people in Washington, D.C.? I think if that were to happen, Donald Trump wouldn't last 2 hours in power, okay? It'd be like 30 minutes, he's eating dinner, it's his last dinner, and then he's gone. He's resigning, it'd be over. For 75 million people, you'd crush the whole city. I don't know what would happen if 75 million Americans protested. Like, I'm trying to imagine it in my mind, and it's actually a little difficult to see just how much it would take to organize a movement that would gather 75 million people in one city, in one area at one time to protest government corruption by billionaires. Where have I heard that before? Corruption by billionaires somewhere? Is that just in Chile and in Lebanon? I don't think so. So today, the Prime Minister of Lebanon officially submitted his resignation. You cannot sustain in power if a quarter of the population is out there protesting without the government collapsing. I thought there was a really interesting story that the governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon has said that if something isn't fixed in the next few days, the entire economy in the country could collapse within days. So I don't know if the elites there are just saying that to scare off the protesters, to stop people from protesting. Says so much that the governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon is warning of the economy collapsing within days if the protesters continue. And I don't see it dying down. I think people are so fed up with the sort of decades-long corruption, the institutions unable to tackle the corruption. Things don't change in their lives. The same people are still in power. The same families are in power. The same families are stealing money from the public. And it's reached sort of this critical boiling point where people aren't going to go back home. And so the demand now is on the elites to change. And I think that is really exciting for democracy, because in some ways it's a sort of horizontal democracy challenging the elites, even those who are democratically elected, but saying like, it's not good enough that you're in power and that we're governing in a democratic way and in institutions, because it's like you're stealing money from people, demanding that they pay more for everyday goods, communication, their livelihood, unemployment. I mean, Iraq, I think, is a really interesting example. People there, it's not just anymore a protest in Baghdad, but it's actually now happening in Karbala and other regions of the country. It's led by youth, the young people protesting corruption, lack of jobs, and many different issues. But as well, it seems like there is a galvanization of Iraqi nationalism against Iranian influence in the country and Iranian power in Baghdad and the current government. So you're beginning to see this sort of movement against the powers in Baghdad who the protesters feel are taking orders from Iran. So you can see how there's sort of this external political situation developing in Iraq. But you are certainly going to also see that in Lebanon as well, right? I could see Saudi Arabia, UAE, other countries beginning to fund some of these social movements, these groups, social movements, different organizations in these governments, right? And of course, the elites in those countries, while corrupt, will say, you see, the protesters are being paid off by foreign actors, and you begin to see that today. But the truth is, the grievances that the people are demanding are so beyond just some foreign actors influencing. The people's demands are legitimate. People know that. People aren't going to give in and say, yeah, this was all just a big hoax by some foreign power. Like, I don't see that's how this is going to end. I hope not. I hope that these movements can be sustained and continued. But you can see that in Lebanon, it has reached a critical point where there has to be now major changes to the country, and in Chile as well. And the sustained pressure of just 5% of the population out in the streets has gotten the leader to give in to quite a few demands: higher minimum wage, more investments in public housing, in boosting the lowest pensions, reducing the costs of medicine. So you've begun to see that higher taxes on the rich, that some of these demands, but it seems like it's hurried, not well thought out plan. It's sort of like, okay, we'll give in now that you're demanding these things, so stop protesting. And I don't see that going away, certainly not in the scale. All the protesters haven't been in the capital, they've been elsewhere. So you're beginning to see that it's beginning to create a sort of a galvanizing movement all across Chile and Lebanon. When it's 1 out of 4 families, that pretty much covers the whole country. So you begin to see that there's these sort of social movements and social pressures really beginning to change the political environment and what's possible. I know that in Chile, Piñera has fired his entire cabinet and brought in new people. Again, that's sort of a gesture that this has totally caught off the guards of the elite who were thinking that everything's fine, the economy is being managed, people are fine. And it's so fascinating to see that, no, it's not. Chile, out of all of these countries that I've been talking about, Iraq, Lebanon, and Haiti, Chile has its reputation as a developed country or almost developed country. Great institutions, they're strong, things are well organized, especially relative maybe to Argentina or Brazil. Things are strong in Chile, but you look beneath the surface in Chile, that's not what you actually see. Basically 100,000 people control about a third of all the wealth in Chile, oftentimes connected to the copper industry in Chile. So you see how in Chile there is this entrenched elite, okay, that historically has been in power, benefited from the Pinochet dictatorship, has essentially come to control large parts of the economy. And people are beginning to rebel and demand that there be greater redistribution of wealth, been greater inclusion of different social classes, different environmental issues, feminist issues into sort of the political project. But I guess the one worry that I have in seeing all of these movements, although really exciting, I think, for democracy, is to say, what can sustain this sort of protest movement in a political sense? So to ask it another way is, what happens after the protests stop? Protests can't continue on, I guess, forever. Maybe they can. Maybe they can continue on for a few months. Several have gone on for several months. So I'm thinking Hong Kong has gone on now for at least 2 months. Protests in Haiti are now almost 8 weeks. Chile is coming to about a month. Lebanon is a little longer. So you've seen these sort of protests be sustained. At that size, against corrupt billionaires, nothing can really stop this. But I think now the elites are sort of moving against these movements, but it's something that is hard to stop. But my worry is that how do you translate this sort of horizontal organizations that are happening, right? Where people in Chile and different countries are getting together and building these sort of communities, social bonds, and then translating this into political power. Like, how will the protests promote their demands in a political system that is itself corrupt, right? Until we can create some sort of communal self-governing systems, I don't see how this ever really is fixed. And then I think that that's the issue I have in my mind is like, how do you translate this into political power, into political change, right? They're like, well, I'm making demands. Okay, what if they give in to half of your demands? And then while the protests die down, behind the scenes, they begin to make little changes here and there, but they don't actually implement the full-scale reforms would actually make a change in the country, right? Opening up transparency, anti-corruption measures, stopping the abuse by the government and things like that. That should have been happening decades ago, but haven't been happening. And that's what worries me is that, like, you, as much as these are, for now, horizontal movements, I want there to be a political party that can take all of this political energy and harness it towards changes, and I mean radical reforms, radical changes to the country's political structure that begin to take on this corrupt elite in power. And I don't know, because I haven't seen it. And I think that that's the issue that people have, is that once you give up this sort of horizontal open access and you create a sort of a hierarchical party structure, that could run for elections, right? Because you need some hierarchy to run a political party. People can cite certain political parties in Europe, but there's still a hierarchy. People can claim there isn't. That can be inclusive of its voters, but there is a hierarchy, and people need to recognize that there is. But eventually, you do have to create some sort of hierarchical power structure to begin to actually implement different changes that the people, protesters, are wanting. The issue when you do that is that some groups are going to disagree. There's going to be a lot of disagreement, and what can keep those different desperate views together, right? Because people are going to see that, like, no, I don't agree with that sort of economics, or I don't agree with that. So it's a lot of differences. What is in so far been a very inclusive social movement or horizontal movement will disagree if there's a hierarchical structure. But maybe the way to solve that is to create a mechanism to say, look, if you want to implement certain policies, we're going to open up the parties voting into the people. So if you're people, you can large number of environmental activists, for example, to get online and demand that this party, whatever it's called, support environmental legislation. Then the rest of the people who might not be, whatever the differences are, have to be internally resolved by who's larger, but still keeping together because there's at least one or two core principles that everybody sort of agrees on. And I don't know what bond that would make, right, in a political party. But that's eventually how I think this thing has to go, is that you have to rebuild the party structures, and you have to rebuild the sort of connection between political parties and the citizens and the people, right? And it's how do you change that relationship so that the parties are more representative of the people, their will, but also look like them, and more inclusive of that process. And I think that will be probably a defining issue if the ability to take this political energy out in the streets and actually convert it into a political process. That would, to me, begin to see some really fundamental changes that could last for decades to come. Otherwise, it's just protest movements that can go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. But unless the country is literally going to collapse, as apparently Lebanon is, I don't know how it can be sustained for actual permanent change that a lot of these countries need, because people's demands are today. Increasing the minimum wage is great, but people are going to have other issues too. Joblessness, cost of living. I mean, a lot of these issues can't be resolved if the government just promises to do one thing. That's what I'm saying. People just promise, yeah, we'll build some more affordable housing. It's like, people have other issues. And so I think there has to be a political party that can include a lot more of these demands in their platform and create a inclusive process. I've heard of these pirate parties. That's what I'm thinking about. And I'm actually on the listserv for the Pirate Party of the USA. I mean, that's what they're trying to build here in the United States. And they're more successful abroad. I forgot where. I want to say Iceland or Sweden. One of these countries has a very strong pirate party. And their goal in these pirate parties is to be inclusive of people and different demands that people have. I am really excited about all of these political changes that are going on. I think that getting people out, especially the large percentage of people, is a telling sign that there has to be some fundamental change to the economic structures, to austerity, to budgets, that billionaires, the lack of accountability for corruption and abuse, police violence, police killings, police shootings, and it needs to be tackled. And look, I think protesting is the first step. I just want to see that eventually there is a structure in place that can demand radical changes into the political powers that exist. And unless those radical changes happen, people can go out and stay protesting, and the government can send out troops and keep fighting this. Unless, you can reach Lebanon's level of 25% of the population. That would be a lot. Look, if Chile can sustain, let's say right now it's 5% of their population, about 1 million people protesting. But imagine if they could get 4.5 or 5 million people out into the streets. No government can stay in power if protests like that are sustained over a set period of time. I don't think any government can stay in power. And I think that that's where this eventually might go. right? Instead of building the political power, they might just continue to be these horizontal structures that just demand radical changes and radical reforms. It makes me think of the political structures that exist today, this very horizontal, organized. So we'll see how this all ends up. Maybe I want political parties, but political parties are a thing of the past, the old way of doing democracy. But I did want to make one comment about something that I haven't really discussed in this recent episodes about Democrats and elections, but I wanted to add this statement because I think it's important to at least mention. So I do believe in democracy and its institutions, despite the failures of those institutions. I believe democratic institutions can change. And it worries me when I hear people, I guess like some of the Democratic nominees, talk about packing the Supreme Court. There's nothing in the Constitution that demands that the Supreme Court have 9 justices. That's just a rule that everybody follows. But it terrifies me that the Democrats, at least a couple people, are willing to discuss ways to expand the number of people in the court in order to get the way and get what they want. And I guess they look back and say, FDR tried to do it, and it's true, FDR threatened to do it, but didn't after a few of the justices decided to change course. And I think this is the terrifying thing about democracy, is that when you see somebody breaking the rules, violating the norms, violating the unwritten rules in a democracy, there's a temptation for you to also violate the unwritten rules because they're getting away with things. And I think if the Democrats follow down that path and don't believe in the sort of set rules and institutions, they become very much like the thing they're critiquing. They're going to follow in and say, well, these rules that aren't written, why do we have to follow them? This guy, Donald Trump, got to do whatever he wants. He broke all the rules and he got away with it. You sometimes have to be better than your political enemies. And talking about changing the Supreme Court or abolishing filibuster, it terrifies me because once you go down that path, what happens when there are 11 members on the court and then the Republicans take control of power and they want to get rid of this court packing because the Democrats now have put 11 members and now they want to, nominate 2 more. So they'll have 2 additional GOP members and they control the Senate. Eventually, what I'm just describing to you sounds crazy, but unless both parties agree to it, there will be a new number, which I don't see them doing. Democracy breaks down. Then it is essentially a struggle between a billionaire class and the masses of people, and say, hey, screw democracy, screw these institutions. Maybe that's what makes me feel like what I'm seeing in Chile and Iraq and Lebanon and Haiti and Hong Kong is that it is a movement between the elites and the people aren't going to build this sort of hierarchical, corrupt structures like the elites do, and they'll just fight the elites on the ground and on the streets until the elites give in and they can stop business as usual. But I just see this sort of decay in democracy, and it's interesting. Look, at this point, I'm not even following who the Democrats are all that closely, but I'm sure I'm going to be talking about it in the future. But quite a few of them have begun talking about, yes, let's go change the Supreme Court. This is how it goes down. And look, the breakdown might not take place in the next 4 years or next 8 years. But once you begin to hear people talk like that, or the GOP might one day wake up and say, you know what, we'll end the filibuster in the Senate. And it's just like at that point, you get this real breakdown in the sort of order and structure in a democracy, the unwritten rules. And essentially it becomes an oligarchy versus the people, which it already is. Arguably it is, but it is already that. But people are still fighting sort of given democracy's rules. And I think what I find perhaps most troubling, or one of the most troubling, is that there are quite a few people willing to just abolish these rules and just get on to the struggle. And the struggle, if there is one, will be brutal. I mean, many people will suffer. I mean, the brutal nature of these struggles. I mean, I saw a report by a feminist in Chile. She was talking about people being beaten by the police, people being assaulted by the police, people being raped, and then people losing their vision, people getting shot by the police. To me, that is a terrifying view, and people in Iraq getting killed, quite a few. I mean, I've seen the numbers be like 100. And so the government crackdown against these horizontal protesters has been pretty violent. I am terrified that the decay sort of are happening in democracies in the United States, especially as with a figure like Donald Trump being able to slowly erode these sort of unwritten rules in the democracy, that you'll see the Democrats adopt a similar language and say, look, they're not following the rules and they're getting political benefits for it, and voters are rewarding them, so why can't we break the rules? And once you go down that temptation, then democracy is dead. And so I'll leave this episode right at that. At democracy is dead. Maybe, but hopefully not. I believe it has to be a set rules. And yes, there are many problems with it. I never take democracy as some perfect set of institutions and rules that is perfect and all the institutions are great and everything works and functions normally. That's never the way democracy works. Nothing is ever fixed or perfect or really well done and it's well managed. Democracy is always this imperfection trying to perfect itself. And I think that that's what I admire about that system. Despite the corruption, abuse, and violence that democracy has been implicated in throughout history, it's the topic to me that I guess I care most about. So I have this sort of very strong feeling for. So yes, I believe in the rules. I believe in, even if it means there's one party that is essentially oligarchical elite party that wants the rules all to itself. But I believe that so far where we are in development, that these rules are best. And without democracy, then you would have this sort of corruption. You would have this sort of corruption and abuse. You know, you wouldn't have any sort of way to create a public commons to battle against the corporate and powerful interests that exist, the sort of private elite interests. You know, without democracy, you don't have a way of counteracting the elites in power, the billionaire class. I mean, it is through democracy that sort of people get to engage and fight for change. And that change is often violent, but it is necessary and change for people to begin to progress. And is it slow? Is it violent? Is it horrific? Is it terrible? Absolutely. But it is one way to actually make sustained change and improvement in life. All right, I'll leave it on an uplifting note that way. All right, that's Collateral Banter, episode 45. More to come, more interviews. Keep listening. I appreciate all the listeners. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Peace.